Today is October 23rd, Monday, and this little video segment is about what has happened in Israel on October 7th and subsequent to that. First of all, disclaimer. I'm a Jew. There's Jewish, American, Ukrainian, Russian, Nigerian heritage, whatever that tells you. Second of all, as you know, I'm a lawyer, also a political scientist, and consider myself a human rights defender. I've also done a lot of nonprofit work, and a former police officer. With all that in mind, my sympathy, my condolences go out to the victims and their relatives in Israel of the terrorist acts, the war crimes, and the crimes against humanity that were committed by Hamas militants and terrorists on October 7th. The heinous, horrific crimes that they committed cannot be justified and do not have an excuse. Period. When you are a Hamas militant and you believe you're at war with Israel because you consider Israel an occupying power, who might argue with you? But if you've decided to conduct a military incursion on Israeli soil and you've confronted Israeli soldiers, well, you're at war with Israel. Then you're going to fight with Israeli soldiers. But that does not relieve you of your obligations not commit war crimes against those soldiers. If they decide to surrender to you, or if you've captured them, or they've run out of ammunition, or they're unarmed, you have to be humane. You have to take people prisoner. It's prisoner of war. You can't execute people on the spot. You can't beat them. You can't kill them. And I don't care whether the Palestinian Authority or Hamas or whoever else has signed the Geneva Convention or not. This is 2023, and anyone who has internet access and any moral theological compass, including being a normal Muslim, understands these obligations. These obligations also extend not just to male soldiers, but to female soldiers. And law enforcement, Israeli police officers, male or female, right? If you've decided to engage people militarily, well, you better hope that the law is on your side, both international law and domestic law. Because if it's not, then what you're doing is you're committing crimes. But what we saw, unfortunately, were Hamas terrorists, and the reason why I call them terrorists is when you start assaulting civilians during any sort of a military activity, regardless of whether you think they're occupants or they're in cahoots with some regime, once you start assaulting people, killing people, torturing them, beating them, decapitating, whatever else happened, burning people alive, you are not just a war criminal. You haven't just committed crimes against humanity, you've committed acts of terrorism and should be dealt with as such. No excuse. I don't care whether you think Israelis, Israeli citizens, Jews, or Israeli settlers have violated your rights to live freely and peacefully in Palestine, if they've unlawfully evicted you from your land, if they have persecuted your people. This is not the point. Two wrongs never make a right. Once you have lowered yourself to the point of committing, this is in revenge, in retaliation, these heinous crimes, then you have no moral standing, and you deserve to be dealt with accordingly. When we deal with terrorists, regardless whether these are Hamas terrorists, Al-Qaeda terrorists, ISIS terrorists, any terrorist organization in the world, who have caused injury or death to civilian population, as well as damage to critical civilian infrastructure, number one goal is to neutralize them, to make sure they can't continue committing crimes or commit additional crimes. Number two, we try to capture them, right? Arrest them, detain them, if it can be done safely. If not, then we use deadly force, all the way up to killing someone, right? If they offer resistance. That's how terrorists are dealt with. If you've decided to go on a jihad and consider yourself a martyr or shaheed and you're willing to do all this, well, I think you're going to have a revelation once you get to the other side. Because since we all have the same God, the God of Abraham, right? You're Well, all of us on this planet have one God, as far as I'm concerned, regardless of our faith or how we believe Him or how we define Him. Once you get to the other side, you're going to realize that there's no excuse for killing women and children. There's no excuse for beating, torturing, and killing unarmed or helpless or wounded soldiers. Period. Now, unfortunately, this took place. And like I've said, my condolences to Israel, and Israel has my full support in bringing these terrorists, war criminals, and people who've committed crimes against humanity to justice, to neutralize them, to make sure they're not able to commit these crimes again, right? Hopefully, bring them to court, prosecute them. If necessary, and if it's available, give them the death penalty or life in prison, with or without the possibility of parole. That's up to the Israeli justice system or some other international tribunal if one is to be established. Now, but subsequent to October 7th, we've seen retaliation from the Israeli side. Obviously, the first thing that the Israelis had to do, both law enforcement, internal security, Shin Bet, and Tzahal, the armed forces of Israel, was to neutralize the militants that were still on Israeli soil, to make sure that the border with Gaza was secure, to make sure that anyone on Israeli territory who had been captured, taken hostage, was freed, and militants did not remain on Israeli soil. Then the next step that the Israeli armed forces took was to neutralize the threat of missile launches from Gaza. I'm not going to go into a discussion of who's right and wrong about launching missiles, but things are also very simple. If you have missiles with limited accuracy, and you've decided that your country or your state, recognized or not, is at war with Israel, again, you're subject to the rules of war, which means you cannot just launch unguided, inaccurate missiles into civilian areas, because you're going to be committing war crimes and crimes against humanity. And whatever the Israelis have done to your people before that does not excuse or justify your actions, period. So the Israelis do have the right to protect not just their military facilities from missile attacks, because that's war, right? Each side protects their own military facilities and weapons and infrastructure and soldiers. But Israel has a full right to protect its civilian population and infrastructure from these attacks. It protects them by intercepting missiles, and it also protects them by destroying the missile launch sites and the missiles and the people who launch them and the infrastructure where they're stored or manufactured. That's simple. No one's going to argue with that. But that does not give the Israeli armed forces the right to commit war crimes, crimes against humanity. How do you commit war crimes? If you know that terrorists are hiding in civilian areas, in areas with very thick, dense civilian populations, and as we know, the Gaza Strip, the majority of its residents are below 18, they're women and children, then you have an obligation to protect those women and children, even if they happen to be family members of the terrorists that you're seeking to neutralize or capture. So if we like it or not, if Hamas terrorists are hiding missiles under a residential building which contains women and children, you can't just launch a missile at it and destroy it, because you're going to kill innocent women and children. And the argument, well, they're not innocent because they're, the wives of terrorists or they're the children of terrorists. Number one, since the beginning of time, there's been a precept among many cultures that you should not kill your enemy's women. Women are, unless they're combatants, unless they have weapons in their hands and they're fighting against you, like Amazons. What you have to do is you have to neutralize them and capture them, right? And even the Torah had rules of how you could deal humanely with female captives, right? Read the appropriate sections of the 5 books of Moses on that. With children, children do not get to select to whom they're born. A child does not get to select whether he is born to Orthodox Jewish parents, Israeli parents, Palestinian parents, or whatever other race or nationality, or where and when he was born. That child needs to be protected because he or she is an innocent life. That child is a hostage of circumstances, right? And he or she did not choose those circumstances. If we start to wantonly disregard the health and safety of women and children, including our enemies, then not only are we no better than our enemies, but we have started to disregard traditional human rules of war. And I'm talking about rules of war of insane regimes, whether it's the Nazis or someone else, right? We're talking about honorable civilizations, honorable armies, and honorable rules of war. Although throughout history we've had plenty of examples where armies have massacred women and children out of vengeance, out of hate, retaliation, and also to scare others into submission. I've never approved of that, and trust me, neither does God. When you shed innocent blood like this, you will have to pay for it. So, my heart and my support goes out to Israeli army soldiers and security personnel whose job it is to neutralize the Hamas terrorists and the militants that committed terrorist acts, war crimes, and crimes against humanity in Israel on October 7th and the following few days while they were still on Israeli soil, or while they were launching missiles at Israeli cities. You have the right to deal with those people because Israel is your country and that is your job to protect your citizens in your country. But that right does not give you, right, that responsibility, that authority does not give you the right to commit war crimes against Palestinians living in the Gaza Strip. Crimes against humanity, or heaven forbid, even terrorist acts. So indiscriminate shelling, bombing is not a morally defensible or a legally defensible option as far as traditional or international laws of war are concerned. As I've said, I know a number of countries have not signed all or some of the relevant conventions that govern how you conduct warfare. Geneva Conventions and other treaties, including against cluster munitions, mines, and everything else. Regardless, if we, right, or if we as Jews, I'm not an Israeli citizen, but if we as Jews support retaliatory commission of war crimes against innocent Palestinians, then we're no better than the terrorists that we're fighting against. Because we're starting to commit crimes of a different nature or crimes of the same nature. Two wrongs do not make a right. So Israeli soldiers and armed forces have my full support to do the right job. That is, bring people to justice, to neutralize them, and defend Israel from further attacks. But you can't try to wipe Gaza off the map. You can't pulverize, destroy, level city blocks, buildings, entire neighborhoods. But what we've heard recently, after October 7th, are Israeli politicians, spokesman for the Prime Minister's office, for the Israeli Defense Forces, announced that we're going to, number one, they've said, and I don't even want to quote things like this, but you have to because they were said. The responsibility of civilians in Gaza is entirely in the hands of Hamas. I'm sorry, but that's morally and legally not true. Okay? If a people have what you consider an authoritarian or an evil government that's committing crimes abroad, does not give you the right to kill those people, even if they democratically elected that government before. Because when they democratically elected it, They didn't sign, by electing you, we authorize you to commit terrorist acts in Israel, to commit war crimes in Israel, crimes against humanity. That's very certain and that's very clear. Second thing, the Gaza Strip is not an independent state that neither Israel or other countries have recognized. What does that mean? It's very clear. What this means is that you're not allowed to engage in particular conduct. You have a responsibility for individuals who live in that soil. It's that simple. It's that simple. If you have that responsibility, you also have the responsibility to evacuate any civilians, properly and safely evacuate them, before embarking in serious military action that's going to cause basically devastation of civilian infrastructure. So you can't say, especially since Gaza has been pretty much under an Israeli military and legal blockade since 2005, you can't say, well, where these people go is going to be their problem. The problem of Hamas or the problem of the Gaza Palestinians themselves. Where are they going to go? You can't forcefully evict these people to Egypt. What legal authority do you have to take a local population of an enclave that's formally and informally occupied by the Israeli military, right? Or blockaded or surrounded, under siege, and force these individuals to travel to another country? What if Egypt doesn't want to accept them for whatever reasons? It's Egypt's right to say, no, we're not going to allow the 1 million or 2 million Gaza residents to come into our soil. Because we know full well that once they come into our soil, they're also going to bring Hamas with them, radical Islam, elements of the Muslim Brotherhood or similar ideology, or even members of the Muslim Brotherhood. And we've already been through that in Egypt. Plus, we're not going to facilitate or participate, even tacitly, in the unlawful eviction of Palestinians from lands where they've lived for hundreds and thousands of years. That's that. Same thing with Jordan, same thing with Lebanon. Safely evacuating people. What, you're going to make women and children walk for tens of or hundreds of miles somewhere? No, they can't do that. You have to provide transportation, right? If you're going to conduct a lawful anti-terrorist operation to neutralize, detain, destroy terrorists, their infrastructure, then you have to do it lawfully. Even if it's not terrorists, but militants of an opposing force. Because Hamas, in the very least, is a force that's opposed to the current Israeli government and the state of Israel, and questions the right of the state of Israel to exist. And if Hamas is launching indiscriminate missile attacks on Israel, which also hits civilian targets, then you have the right to protect your soil. Even if these were accurate military missile attacks against legitimate military targets, you still have the right to protect your military installations. But now you have to organize the evacuation of those civilians. What does that mean? Buses, food, transportation. What if you, and let's not forget about the evacuation of the wounded, right? I've worked in ambulances and rescue squads enough to understand how important that is. And here we have war injuries, right? Trauma from shrapnel, from missile fragments, from bullets, crushing injuries from collapsed buildings and everything else. These patients require a lot of care during medical evacuations. We know how complicated that is. If you say, I don't care, it's the problem of Hamas, then you're committing war crimes and crimes against humanity. Because the vast majority of those women and children became injured from Israeli bombs and Israeli missiles, right? Maybe some of them were injured by an errant missile that Hamas launched and it didn't launch right and landed on the Gaza Strip. I'm sure that happened, considering how many missiles were launched at Israel. That's the responsibility of Hamas. But the vast majority of the women and children who were injured and killed since October 7th in the Gaza Strip were from Israeli weaponry. And we're not given the opportunity to safely evacuate, and we're not provided with an organized evacuation. Question is, where are you going to evacuate them to? Well, if you've designated a particular area of the Gaza Strip that you're going to evacuate them to, then you need to set up temporary housing with water, with food, with medical care, with sewage, with communications, right? Because otherwise you're going to have a health disaster and people will die from lack of food, lack of clean water, lack of medical care, lack of sewage in other facilities, right? These are basic hygiene issues. So unless you've set up safe, acceptable, and livable temporary camps and provided safe transportation to those facilities, you haven't done your job to be able to properly and humanely conduct an anti-terrorist operation. Okay? If you don't have the space to do it in the Gaza Strip, for instance, the south part or wherever else, then where would you have to evacuate these Gazans? Well, then you're going to have to evacuate them to Israeli soil that borders Gaza. Set up camps with proper security, with proper facilities. And if you're not willing to take that chance, well, guess what, boys and girls? We're going to have to evacuate these Gazans to the West Bank, to the territory that's controlled by the Palestinian Authority. So you'd have to set up hundreds of, not thousands of buses to transport people to facilities that are waiting to receive them properly, with food, with water, with heat, with shelter, with sewage, as I've said, medical care and psychological care, right? And if you don't think that the children of Gaza deserve it, then you've lost your moral theological compass. Because I'll repeat this again, and I'll repeat it 20 times if I have to. Children are innocent by definition. Children do not get to pick where they were born. If you're a racist, a xenophobe, or other discriminatory retard, and you think that children of another ethnicity, children of another religion, children of another race have less rights than your kids, deserve less protection than your own children, are somehow inferior to your children, then I'm sorry, you're an asshole. And I apologize for the profanity. You have no moral defense. We've been through this. And when I say we, I'm not even talking about humanity in general. I'm also talking about Jews. We've been through this. Where Jews were evicted from their land after the unsuccessful uprisings against the Roman Empire, right? In the 1st and 2nd centuries. Where Jews in countries where they lived subsequently faced eviction, often for political reasons, including financial reasons, when wealthy Jewish merchants funded local kings, nobility, and sovereigns, and those, because they did not want to pay, chose to evict their creditors, right? Why pay your creditor? You can evict them and you don't have to repay the debt anymore. Plus, you can also confiscate whatever they owned. And the pogroms that the Jews faced from other religious groups, pogroms from Christians who blamed Jews for killing Jesus, right? Let's think through this. Christians who adopted Christianity, right, which was progressive Judaism, headed by a Jew, Jesus the Nazarene, with his apostles who were all Jews, right? The Jews were blamed for killing Jesus. Even though in the New Testament, in the Christian New Testament, it states that Jesus was executed by crucifixion, which is a punishment that was conducted exclusively in those times by the Roman Empire against those who committed crimes against the Roman Empire, right? Including political crimes of leading insurrections or other groups that were considered a national security threat, right, to Roman occupation. Jews who committed heresy, right, against Judaism, were blasphemy, were stoned to death at the decision of Jewish courts, Jewish religious courts, right? Whether it was the Sanhedrin or someone else. Jesus wasn't stoned to death, so that means he wasn't executed for blasphemy or for heresy. Jesus was crucified, as it states in the New Testament. And we're not going to argue about historical accuracy of the Old or the New Testament because this is faith, this is belief. These are historical texts. You either believe in them or you do not. Okay? Because none of us were there who are here today, none of us were there to know how accurate those written things are. Whether they reflect revelation, whether they reflect historical fact, whether they reflect also political realities of the time, this is irrelevant, right? But let's get back. We as Jews already know, we have felt it on us, what it's like to be victims of pogroms because we belong to an alternative religious group that was blamed for something. We also know how Muslims were targeted in countries that were persecuting Muslims, or were at war with their Muslim neighbors, or were evicting Muslims from their soil. War crimes were committed against Muslim men and women, and crimes against humanity. The same thing happened when Islam was spreading to new lands after the death of Muhammad the Prophet in 632 AD. None of these things can serve as a proper example or as an excuse for commission of war crimes, crimes against humanity, persecution, and discrimination, including evicting people from lands that they live on, right? I mean, think of it. Someone comes around and says, we're going to evict you. Why? Well, because before these were Muslim lands. We want to get back to our Muslim lands, we're going to evict you. We don't believe Christians should be living in those lands. Or we're going to evict you because you're a Muslim and we consider this as a Jewish land now, so we're going to evict you. Who says so? Our God says so. And everyone has a different version of God, and everyone has a different version of what their faith and people of their faith are entitled to. So let's not get into those religious arguments, because it's all about faith, and we know what holy wars lead to. Lots of bloodshed. Look at what Europe went through, or other places. So getting back to Israel, if you're Israelis today, and you have any influence on the Israeli government, it is absolutely imperative for us to explain to the Israeli government, including its military, that number one, we support your right to self-defense. We support your right to find, detain, neutralize, arrest, if necessarily kill terrorists, because you have that obligation before your people to protect them from terrorists, from war criminals. Number two, we have to get the same message across to Palestinians and other Arabs. Look, the Muslim faith, just like in my opinion the Jewish faith and the Christian faith, and one of my big hobbies is comparative theology and history of religion. So hopefully I know what I'm talking about. Do not justify killing innocent people of a different faith. I don't care whether you consider them idolaters, whether you consider them pagans, whether you consider them apostates or members of some heresy who rejected your God or who rejected your prophet. Faith is an individual choice. Human beings deserve protection, right? Unless a particular faith has core tenets of evil acts. In other words, if you're a member of a faith whose core tenet is, for instance, sacrifice, that your faith says it's okay to sacrifice human beings, women, children, men, in my opinion, that's an evil faith. Like Satanism, right? If your faith has a core tenet that you can cause harm to other people, you can injure, kill, maim, steal from other faiths or other individuals, that committing evil acts is something that your God or your deity welcomes, then as far as I'm concerned, that's an evil faith. And people have the right to protect themselves from that faith, right? Because as we know, it's faith leads to conduct, leads to actions, leads to consequences, and you have the right to protect yourself. Just if you live next door to a witch whose, core beliefs are that it's okay to, poison your water, poison your flock, poison your kids, things like that. Obviously, you're going to protect yourself against that witch or, wizard or whatever else. Because these people then are insane. They're evil. as the Palestinian people, look, I feel bad for you because many of you were displaced when Israel was founded. I'll be honest. You were displaced for a number of reasons. Some of you were fled because some of you, your ancestors fled because they were afraid of what Israel would do. Others fled under pressure, under promises from neighboring Arab states. Let's, come to us, and then afterwards you'll be able to come back once we win our war against Israel. And unfortunately, those Palestinians do not have the right to return to where they lived in Israel under current Israeli law. I think that's tragic because if you were a civilian, who has the right to evict you from where you've lived? That's my humanitarian or liberal opinion. Also, if you live in a country, you deserve the right to equal treatment under the law, right? Other countries have gone through this, where we've had different rights for different people. Remember South Africa and the apartheid that it had. Remember the United States, where it had the discrimination against African Americans, and a number of other countries, right? All sorts of famous examples, where certain people were treated as second-class citizens due to their faith, due to their nationality, their ethnicity, or their race. Unacceptable. So I feel bad for Palestinians who have been discriminated on the basis that they're simply Palestinian, both in Israel and in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. But, dear Palestinian people, if you support, number one, politicians or groups, political groups, that advocate violence against Israeli civilians, this is a moral, spiritual dead end. It's a moral, spiritual dead end to advocate violence against Israeli women, Israeli children, the elderly, just civilians in general. If your political leaders or your groups that you support, or you yourself, do not recognize the right of the Jews to have their own state, right, in the land of their historical religious ancestors, I think that's a moral spiritual dead end. Especially since Islam is the religion of Abraham, right? Ibrahim. It is the religion of Musa, Moses. Islam also recognizes Jesus, right, as a prophet. But the number one prophet in Islam obviously is Muhammad. Muhammad is not a Jewish prophet because he was not a Jew. He didn't speak Hebrew. He didn't read Hebrew. He couldn't read the Torah, so obviously he couldn't become a Jewish rabbi. Gifted man, probably the greatest last prophet that has existed, that I know of. But who knows how many other prophets have been around in other faiths that we don't know about. We don't know. But that person deserves respect. What never deserves respect is the right to kill people, is the right to commit violence against people because they have different religious views than yours. Right? Unless these religious views, like I've said, are violent in themselves and present a threat to humanity in general. These are insane views, like Satanist views. So that's what we have. So please, if you're a Palestinian, put whatever pressure you can, exercise whatever influence you can on your political leaders to make sure that they're on the right track. And the right track is this. It's not endless violence. It's not fantasies of we're going to wipe Israel off the map. We're going to drive them into the sea. Yeah, good luck with that. Especially since Israel has a strong, fully functioning army and also nuclear weapons. That's not happening, regardless of who comes to your aid. And it's the wrong thing to do anyway. The proper thing to do is to have a normal, peaceful two-state solution. Obviously, people are going to argue about the borders of those two states. Many Israelis want Jerusalem all to themselves. Many Palestinians also would like Jerusalem all to themselves. Jerusalem is a holy city for three Abrahamic faiths: Judaism, Christianity, and then Islam. I believe that Jerusalem deserves some sort of a neutral status with equal, unfettered, unobstructed access to the holy places in Israel for all faiths, as long as the visitors treat those sites with equal respect. In other words, if you're a Muslim, you don't have the right to destroy the Wailing Wall, because that's the foundation of the old Jewish temple in Jerusalem. If you're a Jew, you don't have the right to vandalize, damage, or impede access to the Al-Aqsa Mosque. That's on top of the remains of the Holy Temple. It's still a holy site. And we've seen this throughout human history where religions have changed, but the same sites remained holy even to subsequent civilizations, to subsequent religions. Right? The sites are holy for certain reasons, but that's a different lecture. So if you are a Christian, that doesn't give you a right to desecrate any Jewish or any Muslim sites. So if all of us, Jews, Christians, Muslims, treat each other's holy sites with respect them, protect them, don't vandalize, don't impede access to them, especially during holidays, during holy festivals, during holy periods like Ramadan or Lent or whatever else. Sukkot, for instance, in Jewish tradition, then we're going to be okay, right? We can be arguing about borders. Some people say, well, the borders between Israel and Palestine should be from 1947, from when Israel was set up, and there was a plan on how to partition Palestine into Israel and the Palestinian state, British Palestine as they called it, right? Some people say, no, we've had subsequent wars, and therefore the borders should be the 1967 borders. They recognize the Gaza Strip as a Palestinian territory. They recognize that West Bank as a Palestinian territory. But we also have to remember that for better or for worse, Jerusalem is a holy city to Jews. Jews want to be able to live in it, want to be able to worship in it, and they have as much right to live in and worship in it as Palestinians. So special status has to be afforded to Jerusalem. If any faith claims exclusive ownership, domain, control of Jerusalem, I'm not sure whether that's a good idea. Just out of fairness and respect to all religions. So if, very Orthodox fundamentalist Jews disagree with me and start saying, you're Greg, you're wrong, you're this, you're that, I'm going to say, guys, I'm sorry, but I have the right to disagree with you. I believe in the same God. I'm a Jew, but I also believe that, given the years that have passed, since our people were evicted from Israel by the Romans, Islam appeared. And many Semites started to live in lands where mostly Jews lived, right? And not just Jews who practiced Orthodox Judaism, but let's also remember the Samaritans, right? So a different type of, Judaism or Abrahamic religion. Close but not identical. So for all those reasons, we have to live in peace. But today, time is running out, and I'm sorry it took me 39 minutes to explain all this. Why? Because every day today, what do we have? We have Israeli civilians continuing getting hurt by missiles launched from the Gaza Strip, by missiles now being launched from Lebanon. And who knows how this conflict will further develop? Who else gets dragged into it? Because it may not just be Hezbollah, right? Hezbollah is supported by Iran. Hezbollah is also supported by certain elements in Syria. We also have an issue of the Golan Heights, which were formerly Syrian soil but have been controlled and occupied by Israel now for a number of years, as a strategic location given its altitude, also a strategic location given the water resources that it has, right? An ability to control surrounding terrain. That's from a military point of view. But how do you justify the annexation or the occupation of neighboring land for military strategic reasons? Well, throughout history, states have justified it and have used it. So we have to make sure that we can reach a reasonable solution that's going to have to be mediated, that recognizes the right of people to have their land, to be able to control their land, to have their own governments, but also respect the right of other ethnicities, other religious group, and other, especially minorities who live there, because nobody wants to be a persecuted minority. Jews do not want to end up living as a hated minority on Palestinian land where they're going to be persecuted, beaten, robbed, killed, maimed, taken hostage, or whatever else. And Palestinians don't want the same fate either, right? People want equal rights, people want respect, and people want safety, right? And the ability to earn a decent livelihood without economic sanctions, economic blockades, and everything else. And I fully respect that. So every day, people are dying in Israel, but right now, every day, more people, an order of magnitude more people, are being needlessly and wrongfully killed in the Gaza Strip from bombing, from shelling. Look, I understand military considerations, just pure, cold-blooded, rational, utilitarian military considerations, where you say, okay, Hamas has underground infrastructure, tunnel systems, where they're storing, hiding soldiers, weapons, munitions, missiles, and in order for us to try to destroy that infrastructure, we have to destroy the buildings that are above it. Hopefully, our missiles, our bombs will penetrate deep enough to make their tunnels collapse, to destroy underground shelters, bunkers, whatever else. I guess that's a military objective. But guess what? If trying to do that is going to involve bombing buildings or neighboring buildings, or bombing buildings in which women, children, and the elderly, civilians live, or these civilians live in neighboring buildings, and we know that once you destroy a building, the neighboring buildings will also get damaged, could collapse. The civilians in them could be injured. Okay? So saying, well, we sent everyone an SMS message, we dropped leaflets. It's Hamas's problem. That's not enough, and that's not correct. The only appropriate solution is, as I've said, it's your responsibility, right, as the governing military presence to organize safe evacuation. If you have to, recruit volunteers from other Arab countries who will help allow them entry into the Gaza Strip to safely evacuate Palestinians. But guess what? The Palestinians are not going to say, well, we'd like to safely evacuate, and then you're not going to give us guarantees that we'll be let back in. Or once you make us all leave, you'll have carte blanche to destroy everything that we've ever had. Then you'll level everything. And where we're going to get the money or the resources to rebuild? These are legitimate arguments. These are legitimate considerations. Unfortunately, when you conduct law enforcement operations to capture or neutralize criminals, including terrorists, or you conduct military operations for the same reasons, you have to be able to accept the risks that you're going to lose manpower. You're going to lose soldiers. You're going to lose police officers or security personnel that are in the right, that are doing the right thing. They're doing their legal job. They have the obligation to protect their governments, to protect their countries, to protect their populations. But those guys are going to die. And obviously you want to minimize your losses, Because people say, look, as far as we're concerned, the life of one soldier or the life of one police officer or security agent who is, as far as the law concerned, innocent and doing the right job in protecting his population, his life is worth 100 lives of criminals or terrorists. And who might argue with that? That's an absolutely correct premise, right? Remember, there's even an adage that says, we'd rather have 1,000 criminals go free than one innocent person be mistakenly executed. And sure enough, right, the life of one innocent person is definitely worth the life of 1,000 criminals. But that also extends to civilians. So while Israel has every right to mitigate the loss of life among its defenders, Israeli soldiers, security personnel, police officers, you can't use that to justify needlessly killing women and children. If necessary, you're going to have to wait it out. But waiting, this whole philosophy of waiting things out does not allow you to conduct a siege that's going to cause war crimes and crimes against humanity, right? Look what happened with the Russian city of Leningrad during World War II. The Germans surrounded it. They kept on pounding it with artillery. The German Air Force, the Nazi Air Force, the Luftwaffe kept on bombing it. But they weren't able to take the city because it was protected by the bay, by the river, by its defenders. And it only had a small lifeline of trucks being able to cross the neighboring lake on ice to deliver food. As a result, I think 1 million or close to 2 million people died during the siege of Leningrad from hunger, from the cold. They couldn't get food in. They couldn't get stuff to warm their homes. Wood, charcoal, things like that. So anyone who says, let's do a siege, let's cut off water, let's cut off electricity, let's cut off the delivery of food supplies, medical supplies, and we'll force them into submission, is insane and no better than the war criminals during World War II. Because what you're doing is you're enacting collective punishment against the civilian population, right? And that goes for any side of the Israeli-Palestinian or the Israeli neighboring Arab conflict. If people in Lebanon, whether it's the Lebanese military, whether it's Hezbollah militants, if people in Syria, whether it's the Syrian military or other militant groups, believe it's okay to collectively punish Jews around the world or Israelis, civilians, for wrongs that their government committed or wrongs that the Israeli Defense Forces or the security forces or Israeli Foreign Intelligence, the Mossad, have committed, then you're wrong and you're insane. Okay? Collective punishment against civilians is not acceptable in 2023. And if you say, it is because my God tells me so, well, then I suggest remedial religious training and do a lot of comparative and historical analysis of religions to try to figure out why this approach is wrong, right? It is not a proper approach from a universal point of view. Okay? Even animals don't do that sort of stuff. Okay? And hopefully we're better than animals, right? Speaking of animals, if you're political leaders, if you're religious leaders, start calling your opponents animals or subhuman, then you better reconsider your support of those leaders. Because those people have embarked on a path of false superiority, racism, ethnocentrism, religious centrism and discrimination, or whatever else, or xenophobia as we call it. Okay? We've already seen what was done to the world by Nazi Germany, because Nazi Germany ideology committed to an ideology that considered the Aryan race superior to other races, and allowed the Aryan race to rule and govern over other races, even if it took wiping them off the map, pushing them from their lands. Look where it got them. But we lost millions in Europe. The Soviet Union lost like 30 million people because Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union, wanted to have the living space, Lebensraum as they called it, wanted to seize natural resources in the Soviet Union, especially the oil and gas that they needed for the Nazi war machine, and the coal and the metals and everything else. And their job was, we're going to exterminate people that we consider unwelcome. We'll exterminate the Jews. We'll exterminate gypsies. And on those territories, we're going to settle them with German farmers, and we'll only leave enough of the local population to support personnel. Everyone else will either push out, starve out, or kill. This will be our new living space. This is what we call plantation mentality. We come in, we seize land, so we can have great plantations. The local population will be enslaved or will become serfs. They'll serve us, and it'll be all good. This is evil stuff. Doesn't get you anywhere. Okay? So if you're religious or political leaders, start talking shit, pardon my French, about we're superior to other people, and that gives us the right to rule over them, govern them, have preferential treatment, or displace them from their lands. This is bad news. And regardless of what faith you practice, okay? As I've always said, fundamentalists, people who have fundamental religious views, are dangerous. Because once you have radical fundamental religious views, those views can be justified to commit acts that we otherwise would call crimes, right? A crime cannot magically turn into a rightful thing just because we've done it under the color of religion, right? I mean, think of it. Remember how in the old days, all these witch hunts, they would go after women they didn't understand because these women were versed in healing, and this was passed on to by tradition from mother to daughter and so on and so forth, and men didn't really understand how they did all these things, and they're like, oh, they're evil witches. Not only can they not heal us, but they could also poison us, influence us. Let's burn them, let's drown them, let's kill them, stone them. So, crimes against women who were never proven to be guilty, right? Like they say, beyond a reasonable doubt in the court of law, were proved by being done under the color of authority of religion and religious ideology. Hey guys, it's 2023. I hope we're beyond this, right? Because this is now, we're already 1,400 years, 1,500 years past the lifetime of Muhammad, the great Muslim prophet, the father of Islam. We're 2,000 years past, the life of the historical Jesus, the father of Christianity, right? The Messiah of Christianity. How many years have passed since Jews have gone through being slaves in Egypt, being persecuted in Egypt, or being taken as slaves to Babylon, Babylonian captivity, displaced from their lands? So hopefully all of us have learned these lessons. How many years has it been since Christians were slaughtered by invading Muslims in Spain? Christians were slaughtered by invading Muslims in European countries that came under Islam rule, including under Ottoman Empire rule. All faiths have experienced on their backs what it's like to be persecuted, discriminated, killed, enslaved, driven from their lands, expelled, exiled by opposing religious groups. Have we not had enough? Okay? I'm not saying that atheistic democracy is a panacea. It never is. Because you need to have a moral, theological, basically foundation for a legal system to be stable for centuries. If you have any legal or political system that's simply based on human philosophy, regardless of how great that political philosopher is worshipped or considered, guess what? 50 years people say, he was wrong, she was wrong. Let's enact a different philosophy. Good example is what happened with Marxism or Leninism or things like that. So let's hold on to our moral theological foundation, but let's also learn the right lessons from history and reject any doctrine of violence that allows us to discriminate other people, to persecute people of other faiths, to expel them from their lands, to kill them, to enslave them, or whatever else, and to commit war crimes and crimes against humanity against them. In these last couple of minutes of this video, I would simply like to appeal to people who are in positions of influence and positions of power, businessmen, politicians. Also, I'd like to appeal to lawyers, to military personnel, to law enforcement personnel, and people in the criminal justice system, such as prosecutors and judges. All of us, especially those in these fields that I've just mentioned, have the obligation to protect civilians, to protect women and children. This goes both for Israeli civilians and for Palestinian civilians, and for civilians in other neighboring countries, whether it's Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, or even Persian countries like Iran. We cannot continue to commit war crimes, crimes against humanity, and think that this will lead to peace. It does not lead to peace, okay? Sooner or later, I believe in the laws of karma, this is going to come back and bite you. There will be blowback. We've seen the type of crimes that the Allies committed against Nazi Germany, against the Axis powers, including also Japan during World War II. The Japanese hit Pearl Harbor, legitimate military target. In response, U.S. Army Air Forces firebombed Tokyo, killed hundreds of thousands of Japanese, civilians, who happened to live in this capital city that had lots of wooden structures, and they used special incendiary bombs. Let's not forget about Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Nuclear bombs dropped when Japan was pretty much contained. It wasn't going anywhere. It was out of fuel, it was out of other things. We dropped nuclear bombs, when I say we, the United States, against civilian cities. By the way, those cities had the highest percentage of Christian population in Japan. Coincidental, huh? And some people suspect this was done not just to punish the Japanese, but to test the bomb and also serve as a deterrent to the Soviet Union. Right? This is a war crime, as far as I'm concerned. Not to mention the fire bombings of Dresden. Dresden was firebombed, if I'm not mistaken, mostly by the British, right? 3 days before the Soviet forces entered the city. What was, if I'm not mistaken, what was the need to firebomb Dresden and burn alive people who boiled in rivers if they tried to escape the heat in rivers, who burned alive in bomb shelters? The firebombing of Hamburg, same thing. These are war crimes, and those crimes cannot be justified by prior Nazi crimes, even concentration camps. You can't say, the Nazis burned Jews and other people in prison were in a concentration camp, so that gives us the right to enact collective punishment against Nazi Germany by destroying civilians. So let's defend civilians, let's put an end to war crimes, crimes against humanity, and terrorist acts in the Middle East. Israel, the West Bank, Gaza, and neighboring countries. Let's not defend it, let's put it to an end, and let's reject this type of philosophy. Thank you for being with me, and I hope you believe me and support me.